the Greek term there is actually face receiver,
Yes.
which I always thought was really fun. Is like, I'm going to receive your face. Well, hello, everyone, and welcome to the Bible Geeks podcast. I'm Brian Shealy.
I'm Ryan Choi.
And thanks so much, everyone, for tuning in. You know, we naturally drift toward people who look like us, think like us, maybe even vote like us. We love the echo chamber communities because they're comfortable. But here in this mini episode, we're going to find out that the gospel doesn't find a community that fits. It creates a family out of people who don't.
So today we're looking at the first century status and identity walls that grace turns into rubble, and why the most unlikely people in the world are exactly who Jesus wants at his table.
All right, so Titus chapter 2, verse 11 says, "For the grace of God has appeared, bringing salvation for all people." And I want to focus here on these last two words here, all people. Although the word appeared here in this context is also very cool. It is the word that we get our word epiphany for, which is kind of cool. It is made visible to us all, bringing salvation to all people. So this is kind of scandalous, right? That salvation comes to all people. So why is it that we have such a hard time with this all people in this verse, do you think?
Well, we just talked about Jonah in our last episode and how he was not too happy about grace being shown to his enemies whenever he had just received plenty of grace himself.
Yeah.
And, I think that there's the parable Jesus has about the guy who was the last to show up as a laborer that only worked for the last hour.
Oh, yeah.
I think there's a lot of different categories and divisions we might want to make. I mean, the New Testament is certainly full of barriers being broken down, and we may like to think of ourselves as beyond that, but we have our own kind of prejudices and barriers that we can construct, I think.
I feel like you're right on the money. I don't tend to think of my friends as all being a homophilious group of people who are all very similar to each other, but
quite a word.
We all very much are. Like I tend to gravitate towards the people who are similar to me, just as a natural way. And I don't think our churches are very much different than that sometimes. I think across America, even, we probably gather into little groups of people in our churches that may look very similar to each other. And I think the call here is that if there is a wall of division, if there is something between us that could stand in our way, we need to let the grace of God appear and bring salvation to all people, and not hold it with a spirit of favoritism or preference or anything like that. I actually was reading a quote from Pliny the Younger from like around 112 AD, early church kind of times. And he was talking about how there were some suspicious things going on amongst these quote unquote Christians because they ate together across class lines. And just thought it was kind of interesting that, like, even in the earliest church, Titus 2 verse 11 was being practiced. And there's another verse that we're going to talk about here on this episode, Galatians 3:28, that's going to serve as the basis for a little game that we're going to play, all about using our sledgehammer to knock down walls that we might build up. This verse here, Galatians 3:28, "There is neither Jew nor Greek, there is neither slave nor free, there is no male and female, for you are all one in Christ Jesus." So let's bring up a couple different scenarios here, Ryan, and we can talk about how our modern day sledgehammers can get used to break down some of these barriers we might put up between ourselves. You ready to go?
Let's do it.
All right, round one, buddy. Here we go. So the wall is status and power. And the examples here we're going to talk about are Philemon, who was a wealthy legal owner of a slave, and Onesimus, who had run away as Philemon's slave. And how does grace break down this wall like a sledgehammer? Go.
Paul places himself in between Philemon and Onesimus in this real imitation of Christ, as Christ has grabbed a hold of different groups and pulled them together, whether it's Jew and Gentile, these different groups we're talking about. Here we're talking about slave and free. And he is saying, hey, if there's a debt owed, put it on me. If there is, he's doing the ministry of reconciliation and trying to bring these together and saying you can't just think of each other like you used to think of each other. And so he's challenging Philemon to accept Onesimus, but Onesimus was going to need some courage and some faith to go back. And it's possible that he is even reading this letter to Philemon. And so there's a book, I think it's Paul and the Faithfulness of God by N.T. Wright. He starts with Philemon, and he basically says, if this was the only book, this one chapter, this is the only thing we had of our New Testament, it would tell us something revolutionary had happened, and it was all centered in this Christ.
That's so powerful. Yeah. I do feel like Philemon's example here is maybe one of the most powerful examples of the change that happens in a community. And that's really what this little mini episode is focused on. Like, we can talk about grace and we can spiritualize these things. We can think about them in like these very, mystical kinds of ways. But like, I think the point is that not only does grace change me, but it changes me to then become an arm into the lives of other people and to break down the kinds of barriers. And as Paul is like just championing a new community of people, he is trying to bring this church together in the most unified way possible. He has, like you said, has to stand in the gap between two people and deal with real life, actual day-to-day problems. And this is not like a theoretical thing that he's dealing with. This is like on the ground kind of work. And imagine what is going to happen for a master to have his slave at his table with him and to share a meal and to share the Lord's Supper together and to treat him in this way. And this verse in Philemon 16, you are no longer a slave, but as a dear brother. Like the change in his status that Onesimus is going to have is going to mean so much between their relationship. And I just think, like, for today, we don't have clear and present like slavery like they did at this time. And even the slavery back then that he's talking about is different than maybe the one that we knew in our own most recent past. But at the very least, we have these like asymmetric relationships between us where there's like power imbalances and there's like, you have the authority and I don't, or you have the money and I don't, or whatever, like your boss and your employees and things like that. I think when we start to see that there are people in our communities, in our churches, who they may not be the scholar, they may not be the one who knows everything, but they still bring so much to the table. I just feel like we need to take something here about status and power from this story and make it like real in our day-to-day relationships today.
Yeah, there's a word, social capital, that I've heard used to describe, like, there are just certain people, maybe they're a doctor or a lawyer, maybe they have wealth, they drive the nicer car in. When we go over to their house, it's like, we can't even imagine. We could fit 5 of our houses into their house. And it's like, wow, they are somebody. Physical attractiveness, in intelligence, in accomplishment, it doesn't matter. And that is what Galatians 3 is about. But then what this leveling that's at the heart of the book of Romans, the book of Corinthians, the book of, like so many of the books of the Bible are trying to bring a unity where these walls have not been sledgehammered, to use your game here.
Yeah, I think that's good. So let's move on to our second round here. The second round here is about Peter and Cornelius, and this addresses another facet of this verse in Galatians 3, verse 28, where Peter is a devout Jew. Cornelius is a Roman pagan outsider. He's a Gentile. And so here in this conversation, let's break down the wall between Jew and Gentile. How does this manifest in our culture today? Probably not between Jews and Gentiles, but maybe like heritage or culture or something like shibboleth, or I'm thinking in that realm.
Yeah. Okay. So just bring it to the practical.
Yeah, let's do it.
I would say, I mean, there is an insider, are you one of us kind of thing that can happen. Your shibboleth in, maybe the people the college you went to, are you using the same terminology I use that tells you you're in our tribe, and how much do you know, if you're newly converted and you're saying all kinds of things and talking about shows we would never watch, and everybody at the dinner table is now uncomfortable because you've shown yourself to be an outsider rather than an insider. And so how do we make the space and the grace to, maybe those are correct things that we should be, as we're making them, as we're training them in the discipling of Jesus, in the way of Jesus, that we need to teach, but we also need patience and grace. And maybe a lot of those aren't really what should be the marker of the community of faith, like Peter ran into in Galatians 2, the chapter before this, which seems to be the heart of the book of Galatians. And Peter didn't want to sit and eat with these other people who maybe ate non-kosher food, or they weren't circumcised or whatever. And so we need to let the mark of the community be, is this person a servant of Christ? Have they placed their trust, their confidence, their loyalty, their obedience? They were, as Galatians 3 says, the verse right before our verse says, many of you as were baptized into Christ have put on Christ. And then, and right before that, sons of God through faith. Verse 29, and if you are Christ, then you are Abraham's offspring, heirs according to the promise. So at the heart of this whole thing is bringing together, at that time, the biggest issue of the day, Jews associating with Gentiles.
Yeah. I think there's so many different walls of dividing line here, like with just culture and what we're traditionally used to and things like that. So I think you nailed a few of those. I was thinking here from Acts 10, how Peter is told to not call any person common, or, what God has called clean, don't call unclean. And he says later on there in verse 34, truly I understand that God shows no partiality. And just that idea of partiality is such a cool, it's like the Greek term there is actually face receiver, which I always thought was really fun. Is like, I'm going to receive your face. I'm not going to show you partiality. It's you are who you are. And I think there is a special kind of skill to being able to welcome strangers and welcome people who aren't like you. And that is a skill that I just want to constantly get better at. Especially as I think about what a difficult job it absolutely would have been for Peter, a Jew, to be associating with this pagan outsider like Cornelius. I mean, and Cornelius had a lot going for him, right? He was a religious person. Like, he was very devout. He was, so he had a lot of stuff going on for him, but like even Peter just struggled with that, like you talk about in Galatians 2. And I know that is probably one of the more challenging things for me to remember is like, don't retreat, don't pull back, don't be like so, turned away by somebody not using the same terminology or not making me feel comfortable. Like, be a face receiver, like be the person who's like, welcoming. And I think that's something that I can always grow in, especially as I've received that welcome in God's grace too.
Yeah, that, and the partiality word there, it speaks to, you're looking at their appearance, right? At their face, at the outside.
Right.
This is trying to learn to see like God, who doesn't look on the outer appearance. We go back to David and 1 Samuel 16, but he looks on the heart and he sees who is this person really.
Okay, so the last one. If we're going to make this thing a mini, we got to make it fast. So round 3 here. We're going to break down the wall, the dividing wall between male and female here in Galatians chapter 3, verse 28, as Paul is doing there. So let's look, of course, at Aquila and Priscilla and the partnership that they wound up having. How does God's grace build such a connection between Aquila and Priscilla, where the culture around them would have been separating them very clearly from each other and keeping them in very different roles?
It's so cool how they're always mentioned together. Their names are flip-flopped back and forth. It's not Priscilla always in front. It's not Aquila always in front. And that it just shows you this partnership that they have, this equality of honor and appreciation that they have. There was this giant gap in not just acknowledging the difference, male and female are real, this is in God's ordered design, but in the opportunity to be a disciple, in the status, in the ability to sit at the table and be part of the discussion and part of the faith community. Aquila and Priscilla are hosting the church in their house. And, so there is this change in dynamic that's happening there. Again, not distinguishing, as our culture so desperately wants to do, not ruling out the existence of male and female as an important distinction, but making it no longer a status wall in the community of God.
Yeah, well, let me just say it this way, right? Like, the Jew and Gentile were still Jew and Gentile, like heritage-wise, even though he's saying...
Philemon and Onesimus.
Yes, and you get the slave and free, and in Philemon and Onesimus, they were still slave and free. And so, it's not that male and female weren't. So again, we're adding a lot of asterisks on this conversation, but I think it's helpful, right? Because this is a topic of our day. But I do really just appreciate the fact that when somebody was going to go and teach Apollos, it was not Aquila by himself. And in fact, in that case, Priscilla was mentioned first in the ordering of the two of their names. And I think that's intentional. I think it's intentional that she had something to bring to the table. And in the community of the Lord's people, women have something to bring to the table. And men have something to bring to the table. And slaves have something to bring to the table. Like, in all of these things, Christ died for everyone. And so we all have something to honor him with in our lives. And so when we think about verses like this, Scott McKnight has this quote where he calls back to the Tosefta in this Jewish prayer that was offered. He says people used to pray this way in the Jewish culture of the day. Blessed be God that he did not make me a Gentile. Blessed be God that he did not make me ignorant or a slave. Blessed be God that he did not make me a woman. And like that, many people believe that what Paul is saying here is completely reversing that prayer. And this sounds like the Pharisees' prayer, as Jesus would talk about the Pharisee and the tax collector. Thank you that I'm not like this person. And I think the whole idea here that Paul is getting to is like, just break down the barriers between yourself, because we are all one in Christ. Salvation has come to all, as we talked about in Titus chapter 2, verse 11. And then with this one last verse here in Ephesians chapter 2, verse 14, Paul says, "For he himself is our peace, who has made us both one and has broken down in his flesh the dividing wall of hostility." And then he goes on to talk there about abolishing the commandments and the hostility that we would face between us and God, but also the hostility that we would face between each other has been taken care of in Christ and in his death. So just the opportunity to kind of take a second here and maybe think about how we break down these walls in our modern day is it's maybe a helpful way to spend our time in this little mini episode.
Yeah, and what that quote from the Tosefta shows is, one, these are the three great cultural status identity barriers in that culture.
For sure.
And two, the absolute I mean, they think that they are doing some good thing in this prayer.
Yeah.
By appreciating that God did not make them like those people. And so the uppityness of which a Jewish free man is looking on all of these other people and saying, well, man, I'm not like them. It's the Pharisees' prayer. And it helps us to see, you called this episode Grace's Unlikely Community. And I think it helps us to understand how grace is the leveler.
Yeah.
Grace is the thing that changes it, because you imagine Paul going around from town to town, preaching the gospel. And as he preaches, certain people respond to the gospel and it just changes them. Yeah. And other people don't. And so he's baptizing these people who are slaves, and he's baptizing poor people, and he's baptizing Jews, and he's baptizing Gentiles, and there are these awful people who are idolaters, and there are all these different people. He's also laying hands on a lot of these people, and the Holy Spirit is giving them miraculous gifts, revelatory gifts. They become prophets or people who could heal or other things. And he's finding this happens to slaves, this happens to females and males and Jews and Gentiles. It happens to everybody. I mean, not to everybody, but to all of these different categories, any who will come to Christ in faith.
Yeah.
And then he thinks about himself as this person who was the worst of sinners, and he realizes we all get to come to God's table, to use your metaphor from the other day. We all get to receive God's grace, not by any class category, not by any worth, any work, anything that we have done that makes us some special person that deserves it. His favor is shown on those who turn to Christ and follow him.
I love it. So, yeah, I mean, the whole idea here in this episode is just to really focus on the fact that grace isn't just for a select group of people. And it really does have the ability to reclassify people into a new community that don't keep score against each other and don't try to, fight with each other in terms of status, because we all realize not a single one of us has earned our spot at this table. And so to build these kinds of communities today, I think is one of the most powerful ways we can use and extend grace that we've been shown to other people, and be welcoming and friendly, and just to work on our own reactions sometimes and get better at using the sledgehammer of breaking down these silly walls that stand between us.
I love it. Bring the sledgehammer. That's the challenge for the week, but in a, productive way.
A productive sledgehammer to your struggling relationships maybe this week. All right, everyone. Thanks so much for tuning into the Bible Geeks podcast. You can find us on our website, BibleGeeks.fm. Find show notes for this episode in your podcast player or there on our website as well. And until the next episode, everyone, may the Lord bless you and keep you.
Shalom.